My wife said she had a meeting at the restaurant, so I followed her, suspicious. Something inside me screamed that it wasn't just work, it wasn't just any corporate dinner. And when I saw her, in the distance, smiling like she hadn't smiled at me in months, with her eyes shining, leaning her body towards that man, I knew. She didn't just betray me with her body, she gave it something that she no longer gave to me, enthusiasm. And it was in that moment, in that kiss, yes, I saw her lips touch his, as if he were the center of the universe, that my entire world collapsed. The scene lasted seconds, but it was like a slow-motion hit and run. The wine glass she raised minutes before was still full, and that seemed like a symbol to me. She didn't even need to toast to celebrate the betrayal, she just had to smile. They had been there long enough to seem intimate, accomplices, but not long enough to notice my presence, standing still, motionless, completely unprotected, as if I were naked in the middle of the avenue. I took a deep breath. I didn't make a fuss. I just turned my back and walked away. But there, in that moment when she kissed another man in a public place, as if my heart were disposable, something in me changed forever. People always say that betrayal breaks the heart. What they don't know is that, before that, it tears the soul apart in silence. Betrayal eats away at you, like a low, constant fever that you try to ignore until it takes you down for good. I returned home with a taste of blood in my throat, but it was just pride being swallowed. She arrived a few hours later, with a cold smile on her lips, saying that the meeting had been tiring, that the boss was demanding, that everything had gone well. She lied with the serenity of someone who was already used to doing this. And the worst part, she believed that I was still the same idiot who would let it go. What she didn't know, and couldn't imagine, was that I was about to make the most transformative decision of my life. That night was not the end. It was the beginning. Not the end of our marriage, but my rebirth. The kind of rebirth that only happens when everything you love is ripped away from you without warning, without anesthesia. The kind of transformation that is born from raw pain, from humiliation, from swallowed anger. I spent days trying to understand when exactly she stopped loving me, when exactly he came into her life, when she started to desire another body, another look, another touch. But all these questions led me to only one answer: I no longer had any control over her, but I still had control over myself. I didn't react violently. Not that the will didn't arise, because it did. But I realized too quickly that I didn't want cheap revenge. I wanted something bigger. I wanted my own redemption. I began to rebuild myself in silence, at the bottom of the well where she threw me. Every memory of the kiss, every lie she told in the following days, every time she hugged me out of obligation, all of this was fuel for my turning point. I watched. I wrote it down. I planned. They thought they were playing me, but I was writing a new story, where those who fell were those who had risen too quickly, without looking at who was left behind. And when she realized it, it was already too late. She thought he was just her boss. But he wasn't just that. He was her springboard, her delirium of rapid ascension, her symbol of belated freedom. She didn't realize she was being used as much as she was using me. And when their world fell apart, she still had the audacity to turn her eyes to me, hoping for comfort, hoping that I would open my arms like before. Hoping, perhaps, that I would still be your safe haven. But the man she knew no longer existed. And that was the biggest shock she had, realizing that, in the middle of her search for something more exciting, she killed the only one who truly loved her. The most curious thing is that her fall didn't come from my hand. I didn't have to lift a finger. Everything happened before everyone's eyes. And when she looked around, she realized she was alone. Without him. Without me. Without anyone. And me? I was more alive than ever. Reinvented. Surrounded by new people, new opportunities, new emotions. What's more, he was being admired. Respected. Desired. Things she stopped doing a long time ago. And when he saw me again, he didn't recognize me. Because she expected to find a broken man, but she found someone reborn. And that, for her, was a much deeper blow than any calculated revenge. I became a name in the market. I entered into direct competition with the company where she and her lover worked, and in less than 2 years, I overtook them. Lost contracts, transferred clients, and finally, mass layoffs. When it was shut down, due to inevitable cuts, everything seemed like a market accident. But I knew. I saw. She goes down the stairs of the building where she once smiled at him. I saw her lost look, her purse clutched to her chest as if trying to hold on to what she no longer had. And for the first time in a long time, I felt sorry. Not anger, not hate, just pity. Because at that moment, she reaped exactly what she sowed. And only those who once believed that they could betray with impunity are reaped. But don't think that this story ends there. Because as she fell, I met someone. And it wasn't a rushed replacement, it wasn't an emotional revenge. It was different. It was natural. Someone who saw in me what I didn't even know existed. Someone who didn't compare me to anyone. Someone who arrived when I no longer needed anyone, but I still chose to stay. And that changed everything. Because the worst part of betrayal is not the loss. It's the void. It's looking in the mirror and not recognizing yourself. But when you rebuild yourself alone and someone still chooses to walk alongside you, that's true love. Now, you might wonder, what about her? What happened to her after all that? Did you try to come back? Did he ask for forgiveness? Or did you move on as if nothing had happened? And her boss? That man who kissed my wife so boldly in that restaurant? Did he pay the price too? Did he feel the weight of the destruction he caused? And did, in the end, anyone win in this story? You may even think you already know where this is all going. But I can assure you, what happened after the kiss in the restaurant, my deafening silence and my choice not to retaliate with hate, is something you would never imagine. Because some betrayals are so deep that they don't need to be avenged. They take revenge alone. And sometimes, true triumph comes when you simply choose to follow a path they can never reach. But what happened to her on the last date we had, is something that still keeps me up at night today. And not for the reason you might think. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictitious, but they are born from emotional truths that show how infidelity can destroy lives, families, and souls. Each plot is a warning, a mirror, an open wound told with intensity and realism. Get ready, because what comes now, it's not just a story. It's an impact. A fall. And, who knows, a turning point. Good story. On a soft autumn morning, when the sun timidly filtered through the windows of the house with its beige facade and well-kept garden, Thomas served coffee with the same ritual as always, pouring the hot liquid into the 2 white ceramic mugs they had used since the beginning of their marriage. The silence in the kitchen was interrupted only by the subtle sound of the coffee maker and leaves rustling outside. He looked at the clock and smiled when he heard Clara's light footsteps coming from upstairs, as had happened for years, a custom that seemed eternal. Married for 12 years, they lived in a comfortable house on the outskirts of a business town where everything revolved around goals, meetings, and results. Thomas, a software engineer, calm, dedicated, someone who appreciated silence and the predictability of routine. Clara, on the other hand, was the spark, the restless one, a communications consultant in a large company, full of projects, contacts and energy to deal with people all day long. What united them was the delicacy with which they balanced these differences, at least until then. They had one of those stories that felt like it was built to last. They met on a university extension course. He was shy at the back of the room, she was uninhibited in the center, asking questions, interacting with everyone. Clara noticed him for the first time when he dropped his workbook papers on the way out of class and she bent down to help him. From then on, a subtle friendship was formed, built over coffee after class, messages exchanged at unlikely times and a connection that went far beyond physical attraction. When they finally decided to live together, no one was surprised. They were the type of couple that exuded harmony even in silence. In the first years of their marriage, Clara and Thomas completed each other with almost surgical precision. He found in her the lightness that was missing in his methodical life. She saw in him the stability she never had in previous relationships. They built a comfortable routine together, full of small traditions. Sunday was park and ice cream day, on Fridays, dinner at your favorite restaurant. Every day, before bed, they exchanged a phrase of affection, a small gesture that seemed unbreakable. Their friends called them an exemplary couple, and perhaps that's why they both tried so hard to maintain that image. Thomas was always a man who believed that love was shown in the details, in small daily kindnesses, in caring for things that seemed invisible to most. While Clara was getting ready for work, he left her coffee ready, separated her favorite fruit and left a note on the table with some silly but sincere phrase. Sometimes it was just, "Good morning, my love," other times something more fun like, "Today you will shine brighter than the sun." And Clara laughed when she read that, even on the days when she was late. She recognized his effort, and until recently, it still moved her. But time has a subtle way of making changes. Not always violent, not always drastic. Sometimes, it just wears down certain surfaces, leaving everything slightly less shiny, less intense. And so, without them realizing it, Clara's laughter began to last less time, Thomas's notes began to be read distractedly and Sundays in the park were postponed until they disappeared completely. There were no fights, there was no shouting. There was only silence and distance. Small voids that, so subtle, seemed to threaten nothing, but that accumulated like dust under the carpet. Clara had recently been promoted, and with the new position also came the need to participate in more events, external meetings, lunches with strategic partners. Thomas, proud, encouraged her, said that she deserved that recognition, that he always knew about her talent and intelligence. But inside, he began to feel a discomfort that he couldn't name. I no longer recognized some of the conversations she brought home, the new names, the colleagues with whom she shared inside jokes, the extended lunches that sometimes lasted through the night into happy hours. He listened, smiled, but felt increasingly out of place in that new world that surrounded her. Still, he never let on. He continued to be the same helpful, attentive, present man. But he was no longer called as often to accompany Clara to events. "It's more corporate, you won't like it," she said. And he believed. Or pretended to believe. After all, there was no real reason to be suspicious. Clara gave him no reason to doubt her. She was still affectionate, she was still kind. But there was a filter in her eyes, a kind of reserve that hadn't existed before. At work, Thomas was also going through a demanding phase. New projects, tight goals, the need to constantly prove yourself in an increasingly competitive market. This made him quieter, more introspective, and at times, too tired to notice the signs that were accumulating. Clara, in turn, immersed herself in the corporate world with new energy. She was noticed, praised, valued. "I spent more time away from home, but I always justified it clearly, meetings, presentations, training." One day, while folding freshly ironed shirts, Thomas found, in the pocket of one of Clara's blazers, a business card with a handwritten note. It was from a senior executive at her company. The written sentence simply said, "Dinner at 8 p.m., Voluto Restaurant. Our secret." He read it more than once, his heart racing instinctively, but then he forced a smile to himself. Maybe it was an old invitation, some gift she forgot to throw away. It didn't make sense. He decided not to ask. He preferred to ignore it. Because sometimes, the fear of the answer is greater than curiosity. He was a man who valued trust. Maybe even too much. He believed that respecting his partner's space was part of mature love. He never broke into her cell phone, never read messages secretly. Not even when she started arriving later. Not even when he started sleeping facing the other side of the bed. For him, the commitment they had made one day at the altar was still solid. He believed that if she had something to say, she would say it. But that never happened. The couple's circle of friends also underwent changes. Clara now frequented more sophisticated, more formal environments, and Thomas, uncomfortable among executives and marketing strategists, preferred to decline the invitations. I felt like I had become an accessory. A decoration for family photos. He noticed the looks she exchanged with certain colleagues, but he always averted his own eyes so as not to see too much. Silence became the most spoken language among them. And this silence, so deafening, little by little shaped the structure of a relationship that previously seemed unbreakable. Despite everything, there was love there. A love that may be tired, perhaps dormant, but present. Thomas still looked at her with admiration when she left ready for work. I still missed her even when they were in the same house. Clara, in turn, still hugged him when he arrived, still called him honey in an automatic tone, still smiled when he told silly jokes. But it was as if they were acting out the roles of a happy marriage without feeling the truth of that script. One rainy morning, Clara announced that she would have a last-minute meeting at a new restaurant in town. He said it could take a while, that it was something strategic. He kissed Thomas quickly, put on his dark blazer and left. He stood there, with the cup of coffee cooling in his hand, looking at the closing door. Something that morning felt different. And for the first time in many years, he felt the desire to know more. Not out of jealousy, but out of necessity to understand. Was the life they were living still the same? Or just the appearance of what they once were? But the answer to that question was yet to come. That week, time seemed to run strangely slowly for Thomas. The hours dragged by as if something was about to happen, something he couldn't name, but that his body already felt. Clara's gestures were different. They weren't aggressive, nor were they cold, but there was a kind of disguised haste in everything she did. The way she avoided eye contact when she spoke, the lack of questions about his day, the brief smiles and hollow laughs. Even the clothes had changed. Fitter blazers, more sober dresses, an aesthetic care that went beyond the usual. Small details that, in isolation, might go unnoticed, but that, together, formed an unsettling puzzle. Thomas, even without proof, began to experience silent anguish. His entire body seemed to resist the idea of suspicion, but his mind was beginning to no longer be able to ignore the signs. On Tuesday night, she announced that she would have a strategic alignment dinner with the communications team and that she might arrive later. He had the phone in his hand, typing something quickly, and he didn't even look up when he spoke. Thomas, from the sofa, pretended not to notice the urgency of that message. But something inside him began to move with intensity. He felt like someone on the edge of a cliff who still doesn't see the ground, but already knows he's going to fall. When she left, silence took over the house in a different way. It wasn't the usual routine silence. It was a void full of noise, an echo of absence that screamed inside him. For long minutes, he stood in front of the window, watching her car disappear at the end of the street, and for the first time in 12 years, the confidence he had always cultivated effortlessly began to give way to doubt. The next day, when she woke up, Clara had already left. He left a note on the bathroom mirror saying he would have a busy morning and wouldn't be back until late afternoon. The handwriting was the same, but the absence of any nickname or affectionate gesture sounded like a code for something bigger. He took a deep breath and decided to go to work early, trying to distract himself with spreadsheets, codes and goals. But his mind couldn't settle on anything. He reread old messages, remembered the first years of marriage, the spontaneous walks on the weekend, the little surprises hidden between appointments. And then he remembered the card he had found days before. That phrase, "our secret," hammered home like a warning he refused to heed. Maybe it was too late, but I needed to know. For the first time, he typed the name of the restaurant online, located the address and mentally plotted a route. It wouldn't cause a scandal. I wouldn't invade anything. He just needed to see it with his own eyes. I needed the truth, no matter how painful it was. On Thursday, Clara said again that she would have an escalation dinner, this time with an important client. She wore an elegant dark blue set, discreet heels, impeccable makeup. She looked beautiful, as always, but there was a kind of tense gleam in her eyes, as if she were about to present something important. Thomas said goodbye with a light kiss on the forehead and wished her good luck. When she got out, she waited a few minutes and, without thinking twice, got in the car and followed. The journey to the restaurant took no more than 20 minutes, but it felt like crossing an emotional boundary. Each kilometer traveled was like ripping away a layer of protection that prevented him from seeing what was ahead. He parked a safe distance away and walked slowly to the entrance. The restaurant was sophisticated, with low lights and an intimate atmosphere. He entered cautiously, like someone carrying a pain that still doesn't know where to land. He didn't have to look far. They were there. At one of the tables in the corner, somewhat isolated, sitting opposite each other. Clara smiled. Not the polite smile she usually wore in meetings, but an open smile, full of something he hadn't seen in a long time. The man in front of her was older, his expression confident, his eyes fixed on her with a disconcerting intensity. He would lean in close to her, lightly touch her hand, say something that made her laugh softly. The naturalness of that intimacy hurt more than any scream. That scene, which could have been banal to any other observer, was an earthquake for Thomas. There was no doubt, there was no dubious interpretation. She was delivered. It wasn't his anymore. And the cruelest thing, she looked happy. He didn't go in. Didn't confront. He just watched for a few minutes, like someone watching their own life being ripped away before their eyes. So he went back to the car and stayed there for a while, staring at the steering wheel, not knowing what to do. I didn't feel angry. I felt such an absolute emptiness that I didn't even know where it hurt. Yes, he cried, but in silence. And in that silence, something began to change. Not love. But the need to remain the same man he loved alone. He realized that he had been left behind a long time ago, and that, at that moment, there was nothing left to be saved from what existed between them. Not in that state. That night didn't end with a fight. It ended with a silent decision, which he still didn't know how to verbalize, but which was already forming within him with the strength of something unbreakable. Clara arrived late, as she said. He entered through the back door, taking off his shoes to keep from making noise, as if trying to preserve a routine that no longer exists. Thomas pretended to sleep. She approached the bed, sat for a few seconds, and then went to the bathroom. He didn't turn around. He remained motionless, feeling her perfume invade the room, a new perfume that she hadn't used before. And that, more than anything, hurt like a silent confession. She lay down next to him with a soft sigh and turned to the other side. An abyss separated the two bodies in that bed. And Thomas understood that, even though they still shared the same house, the same routine, the same spaces, they were no longer together. Over the next few days, he watched her with new eyes. Her every gesture was analyzed with surgical attention. The schedules, the excuses, the smiles on the phone, the way he disguised messages. Everything made sense now. It was all part of a puzzle he refused to put together. And even without saying anything, he started recording times, behaviors, patterns. Not for revenge. But for lucidity. I needed to understand the size of the wound before deciding how to heal it. And the more he understood, the more he moved away emotionally. Something inside him was beginning to harden. Not the heart, but the hope. She continued as if nothing had changed. Hurried kisses, short conversations, well-formulated justifications. Thomas responded with the same neutrality. But inside, he was preparing. Not to destroy it. But to free yourself from it. On Saturday night, as she said she was having dinner with an important director coming from another city, he decided not to just follow. Decided to enter. He put on a dark shirt, left shortly after her and, calmly, went to the same restaurant. I knew the time. I knew the table. When he entered, his eyes roamed the room and found her. It was there, again with the same man. This time, the two were side by side, and the gestures were even more intimate. A subtle kiss on the corner of the mouth, hands clasped, looks that spoke in silence. Thomas felt the floor disappear for a second. But he took a deep breath and headed to the bar. He ordered a drink, pretended not to see them. And there, between one sip and another, I knew that this would be the last time I would witness that scene. He no longer needed proof. I already had the truth. And with it came immense pain, but also a kind of freedom. He knew what would come next. I knew I would need to be cold, calculated, and yet fair. The world she had built outside the walls of the home they had shared for so many years was about to collapse. But what she still didn't know, was that there was something bigger, hidden behind all that, that would make the outcome much more cruel than any betrayal. Thomas spent the entire Sunday in silence, walking from one room of the house to another as if each wall told a different story from the past that he no longer recognized. What were once souvenirs became evidence of a well-staged hoax. And even in the face of the pain that burned inside his chest, he maintained control. He was calm, meticulous, but there was a latent restlessness in his gestures. He was no longer trying to understand the reason for the betrayal, that was already in the past. Now his focus was on what came next. And at that point, something new began to take shape, an urgent need to turn the key to that story. But before taking any action, there was something he needed to do. Something that would change the course of everything. Something he had saved for the right moment. On Monday morning, Clara was getting ready to go out, dressed in an impeccable white blouse, hair tied up, heels steady, gaze focused. Thomas watched her discreetly, sitting at the kitchen table with an untouched coffee in front of him. When she turned to pick up her bag, he raised his voice softly but firmly. He said he needed to talk to her tonight, that it was nothing urgent, but important. Clara responded without looking, saying that the day would be busy and that she would return late, as usual. He nodded, controlling his breathing. Little did she know that that would be the last night she would return to that house with the certainty of owning something inside. In the evening, she arrived after 10. She took off her shoes at the entrance, put her cell phone in her purse pocket and went to the kitchen in search of water. She found Thomas sitting, the light low, an expression she hadn't seen on him in a long time. He asked if everything was okay, but didn't get an immediate answer. He stood up calmly and asked me to sit down for a few minutes. His tone of voice was so controlled that, for an instant, she felt afraid. Fear, not of something violent, but of something definitive. Thomas began by saying that he knew the truth, that he no longer needed explanations, that he had seen enough. Clara, surprised, opened her eyes wide, but tried to hide it with a cynical smile. She said she didn't know what he was talking about, but he cut her off with a simple, "Don't lie anymore." The silence that followed was dense. Clara then lowered her eyes, as if she finally understood that the game was over, and confessed. He said he hadn't planned it, that everything was happening, that he had felt invisible for a long time. He spoke about his coworker, the meetings that turned into dinners, the emotional involvement. He tried to justify it with empty words that no longer had room for acceptance. Thomas listened in silence, each word piercing his skin like knives. When she finished, she waited a few seconds before speaking. He said he didn't want explanations, he just wanted to clarify one last thing. She frowned, confused. He then asked me to accompany him to the office upstairs. They went up in silence. Inside, he pointed to the desk and asked her to open the top drawer. Clara hesitated, but did so. Inside was a heavy, black folder. He asked her to open it. In doing so, he came across printed documents, bank statements, business communications. Little by little, the color drained from his face. What was in her hands was proof of something she never suspected. For more than a year, Thomas had been a majority partner in the startup that directly competed with the company where she and her lover worked. And more than that, he was now responsible for the contract that would define the future of the corporation where they were both employed. Clara stammered, saying that she didn't understand, that it didn't make sense. Thomas then explained that since he noticed the signs, he decided to not just observe, but to react intelligently. He took advantage of the moment of crisis in the market, bought shares silently through intermediaries, gained space with more daring proposals, and now he was about to close a billion-dollar contract with the multinational that until then was the main partner of Clara's company. This meant that cuts were inevitable. And he knew exactly who would be on the list. Clara, astonished, sat down. He raised his hand to his forehead as if trying to contain the weight of the information. He asked why he did that, if it was revenge. Thomas shook his head. He said it was survival. He said he didn't want revenge, he just wanted to regain control of his own story. And that this was the most dignified way to do it. She tried to argue, saying that it would harm her career, that it would destroy everything she had built. But he calmly replied that it was she who destroyed it. That he just followed the path she paved with her own choices. She then despaired, got up, tried to hug him, ask for forgiveness. She said she still loved him, that she made a mistake, that she was confused. Thomas pulled away, looked deep into her eyes and said that no love survives contempt, that she had time to rethink, but chose absence. It was at this moment that the true revelation emerged as a final blow. Thomas took a deep breath and, with frightening serenity, revealed that, weeks before, he had already met with the board of her company. He showed evidence of Clara's relationship with the executive, including messages, records of out-of-hours meetings, and made it clear that, ethically, she violated several of the company's conduct clauses. The lover, in turn, was being investigated for misappropriation of strategic information. And all of this came into the hands of the new CEO, appointed, ironically, by direct influence from Thomas. Clara stepped back, her legs wobbled. He asked what he was saying. Thomas responded that the next day she would no longer have a role at the company. That her name would be erased from the board lists. That said lover had already been disconnected that afternoon. And that, in a few days, the market would know exactly why. She cried. Not just because of the lost job. I cried because I finally understood the magnitude of what I had caused. The marriage destroyed, the trust betrayed, the job ruined, the reputation compromised. He asked what was left of her. And Thomas, with a firm look, said that there was still dignity left, if she knew how to use it to truly start over. But with him, there would be nothing more. Neither compassion nor resentment. Just silence. She fell to her knees on the carpet, her hands covering her face, her body shaking. Thomas just turned and left the room. As he walked down the stairs, he felt the weight of years being lifted from his shoulders. He knew he was neither a hero nor a villain. He was just a man who learned not to beg for love. Who chose to rise intelligently when pain tried to sink him. The destruction she caused was now turned against her, but not at his hands. For life, for choices, for the relentless cycle of consequences. And what Clara didn't yet know, was that the biggest surprise in that story was yet to come. Clara spent that night on the couch, unable to sleep, curled up under a thin blanket that barely covered the cold that was now coming from inside. The hours dragged on like punishment. Every thought was a thorn in the memory. The humiliation of having been unmasked in such a meticulous way, without screams, without scandals, just with irrefutable facts, gnawed at her in silence. Thomas was no longer the peaceful, submissive man she thought she knew. He showed himself to be a cold, calculating strategist, someone who had turned pain into a weapon and silence into strength. When dawn came, she tried to get up and act as if she could still regain control, but each step echoed as a reminder that the world she had built was falling apart, piece by piece, through her own fault. He tried to contact coworkers, but the numbers rang to no avail. Her name was already circulating behind the scenes, like a warning, like a story that people whispered about, but didn't comment on openly. Thomas, in turn, was no longer at home. He had left early, without warning, without leaving any traces. He spent the day in meetings with lawyers, with the new team he now firmly led. The startup he had secretly bet on was now an emerging empire, and his image as CEO was cemented with respect and admiration. But, even though he was involved with numbers and strategies, his thoughts returned, in lapses, to the woman who still occupied that house. Not for love, but for the memory of everything they once represented. He felt distant from himself, as if the last few days had carved out a colder, more impenetrable version of who he once was. And, deep down, he understood that this transformation would not have been possible without the pain that Clara inflicted on him. But what to do now with what's left? The anger had passed, justice had been served, but the emptiness remained. In the afternoon of that same day, Clara was called to the company's headquarters. The email was brief and formal. The meeting would be with the compliance department. She knew what that meant. She arrived punctually, dressed in the best clothes she could find, with her hair tied up impeccably and her eyes hidden by dark glasses that disguised her poor night's sleep. She was greeted coldly by an assistant and left alone for long minutes in a windowless meeting room. When the committee members entered, the looks were all neutral but full of judgment. The statement was direct: the company was grateful for his years of service, but, given the recent allegations and ongoing investigations, it opted for immediate dismissal, without bonuses or transition plans. She listened silently, sitting with her hands folded in her lap. When asked if he wanted to make a statement, he simply replied no. The voice was steady, but the entire body was shaking. He left the building through the back door, as if he were no longer part of the world he was once so proud of. That same night, she waited for Thomas. I needed to speak. He needed to at least understand what was left. When he entered the door, he no longer found the woman he had left behind. She was sitting in the armchair in the living room, her eyes red but dry. He didn't try to hug him, or argue. He just asked him to sit down. He said he knew he had no right to anything, that he recognized every mistake he made. But I needed to understand why he acted the way he did, why he planned everything with such precision. Thomas remained standing for a few seconds, then sat down on the edge of the sofa, far away. He said that, in the first few days, he just wanted to disappear. But as he realized the extent of the manipulation, something inside him began to change. She realized that, to survive, she needed to stop being the man she once loved, or pretended to love. I needed to transform love into impulse. And that's exactly what he did. Clara asked if anyone was there. The answer came quickly, but without hesitation: not yet. But maybe soon. Because now he knew what he deserved. And it wasn't crumbs. She nodded. For the first time in many years, I felt like he was unattainable. He asked if there was any chance of starting over. Thomas smiled bitterly. He said that everything in life was possible, but some choices have no return. Some bridges, once burned, never come back. She said she still loved him. And he replied that he hoped it wasn't just guilt. Because love, without respect, does not survive. And in their case, respect died first. The days that followed were of absolute silence between the two. They shared the same house as strangers. Clara started sleeping in one of the guest rooms. I avoided passing him in the corridors. And when he did, his eyes searched for regret but found only indifference. The pain he felt now was different from what Thomas had felt. It was a pain of irreversible loss. A pain that could not be resolved with apologies. She tried to resume her career at another company, but her tarnished reputation and compromised contacts kept her stagnant. He began to isolate himself, avoid old friends, refuse invitations. She was no longer seen in restaurants or at social events. It was as if he had ceased to exist in that universe that he cherished so much. One night, in the midst of despair, Clara went to the room where Thomas slept. He knocked gently. He opened the door without surprise. She asked to come in. He sat on the edge of the bed and, after long seconds, began to speak. He said he didn't want to justify what he did, but he needed him to know something. And it was at that moment that the last secret came to light. With her voice breaking, she said that the man she got involved with, her boss, didn't approach her out of spontaneous attraction. He knew who Thomas was. I knew about the confidential transaction that was underway between the startup and the corporation. And he used Clara as an access piece. He said that, in the first meetings, he believed it was just an adventure, a game. But later she understood that she had been manipulated. That every dinner, every touch, every approach, was part of a much larger strategy. It became a bridge to information that would never be accessed through legal means. And when I realized this, it was already too late. Emotional involvement mixed with manipulation, and she became an accomplice without realizing it. Thomas listened to her without moving a muscle. His eyes fixed on her, without blinking. When she finished, she just said that she already knew. That this was the last piece of the puzzle. And that was precisely why he didn't go to the police. Because I knew that, deep down, she had also been used. But even so, she chose to lie. He chose to betray. He chose to remain silent when he could have warned. Clara bowed right there, her shoulders shaking. He said he hates himself for everything, that he would give anything to go back in time. Thomas, in a low voice, said that time only moves forward. And now it was time for everyone to follow. He said he had already put the property up for sale. And that, soon, they would both have to get out of there. She asked where he was going. He smiled, for the first time in weeks, and replied that he didn't know yet, but that wherever he went, he would be at peace. The next morning, Thomas left with a backpack and did not return. Clara was alone in that silent house, surrounded by ghosts that she herself created. No room offered comfort. No mirror returned an image she recognized. And, for the first time in a long time, there were no more excuses. Just a path of ruins, left by decisions that could never be undone. And although I still hoped that one day Thomas would knock on the door again, deep down I knew that day would never come. Because he didn't just leave the house. He left a world where she didn't know how to love without destroying. And now, there was nothing left, except learning to live with the weight of one's own absence. The weeks following Thomas's disappearance turned the house into something even more inhospitable than before. Clara remained there, trapped between walls that now seemed to punish her with vivid and merciless memories. The furniture, which previously made up a home full of affection and routine, now seemed like pieces from a personal museum of everything she had destroyed. Silence was no longer just the absence of noise, it was a witness to solitude. And although the world outside continued to spin, Clara seemed trapped in a parallel reality, where time bowed to the weight of regret. She woke up every day without purpose, walked around the house in circles, remembering conversations, trying to reconstruct, word by word, the moment when everything started to fall apart. But no matter how much she sought justifications, the truth was that no version she created would be able to exempt her from guilt. She wasn't just the victim of a bigger game, as she tried to believe the first few nights. He was an accomplice. And the worst part, it was conscious. Little by little, he began to realize that the destruction caused went beyond the marriage. He lost friends, lost credibility, even lost the lightness with which he walked. She was always hunched over, as if carrying an invisible weight. He tried to resume work on some other front, but at every interview there was a kind smile and a courteous apology. The doors closed as if everyone had been warned in advance. That destroyed her more than any formal dismissal. It was as if, in the eyes of the world, she was no longer a professional, but a warning sign. An example of what not to do. He tried to seek help, sought therapy, wrote letters to Thomas, all torn up before being sent, and still, he felt like he wasn't moving. His absence was like a constant shadow. I didn't know where he was, what he was doing, if he was okay. But she sensed that he no longer thought about her. And that, as deserved as it was, hurt. Meanwhile, Thomas rediscovered the world away from the scenario that, for so long, had been his emotional prison. He traveled to other cities, participated in conferences, was invited to lead panels on innovation and crisis management, and received awards for his ability to transform an emerging business into a modern empire. It was in evidence, but without fanfare. He spoke little about his personal life, rarely mentioning the past. Those who knew him closely knew that there was an unspoken trauma there, a silence that did not ask for questions. Thomas allowed himself small pleasures that he had previously neglected. He went hiking alone, watched old movies that Clara hated, and went running again early in the morning, like he did when he was younger. He reconnected with parts of himself that were forgotten. But even in the midst of this rebirth, there was a quiet echo of the pain that shaped him. The wound no longer bled, but the scar followed. And he knew, what he experienced was not something to be overcome, but understood. One cloudy afternoon, he received an unexpected message from a former colleague of Clara's. A discreet woman, who had left the company shortly after the scandal. He said he felt like he needed to tell something, that he had some relevant information and didn't know what to do with it. Thomas hesitantly arranged to meet at a discreet cafe. When he saw her, he noticed the same concern in her eyes that he carried a while ago. They sat down, ordered coffee, and she got straight to the point. He said that, during the final months, Clara had begun to suspect her boss's involvement in illegal movements within the company. She even commented, in a confessional tone, that perhaps she was being used to access confidential files, but that she did not have the courage to report it for fear of the consequences. He also said that Clara even wrote a letter of complaint, but never sent it. That caught Thomas by surprise. For the first time, he found himself facing a piece of history he didn't know. And it shook him more than he expected. He returned to the apartment he now called home and spent the night thinking. He remembered her words, the night she confessed the abuse she had suffered, the fragility on her face, the trembling voice trying to explain that, even though she understood everything, she was weak. That was it. She was weak. But had he, with all his rationality and coldness, not been too cruel? Not with the actions, which he considered fair, but with the absolute cut, with emotional exile. That question stayed with him for days. It didn't make him reconsider feelings, but it forced him to reevaluate decisions. And then, for the first time, he thought of looking for her. Not out of nostalgia. But because I needed to hear the truth from her mouth, without intermediaries, without assumptions. He needed to know if, in the midst of his error, there was some attempt at redemption that he didn't see. Clara answered the door with deep eyes. Her hair was tied up haphazardly, she was wearing an old blouse and her feet were bare. When he saw Thomas, for a second he froze. He thought he was dreaming. He asked to come in. She made room but didn't say a word. They sat in the room, where so many silences were built, and for a few minutes they just looked at each other. Thomas started by saying he didn't expect anything. That I didn't want to go back, I didn't want to rebuild what was lost. But I needed to hear it. He asked about the letter. Clara's eyes widened. It took a while to respond. He said yes, that he wrote it, that he kept it in a folder, but he never had the courage to hand it in. She said she felt too dirty to accuse anyone, that she was up to her neck in it and that, when she realized the size of the web, she no longer saw a way out. He said he thought about telling him everything, but fear of judgment stopped him. That the shame was greater than any impulse to repair. Thomas listened in silence, his eyes fixed on her, but his chest heaved. That changed something inside him. It didn't diminish the error, but it offered a new, human, imperfect, real layer. When she finished, he just said he wanted the letter. She got up slowly, went to a closet and came back with a yellowed envelope. She handed it to him with shaking hands. He asked me not to read it there. He nodded, put it in his pocket and stood up. Before leaving, he turned and said something that completely disarmed her, that he hoped, one day, that she would forgive herself. That her greatest pain, at that moment, was not his. It was the one she caused herself. And that, even though their fate was sealed, he did not want her to die while still alive. When she was alone again, Clara cried in a different way. It wasn't despair. It was an intimate, silent mourning for everything that could have been. For the woman she was, for the one she didn't know how to be, for the one she could perhaps still become. I didn't know if that meeting was an end or a turning point. But there was, in his gaze, something new. No love. Not anger. But humanity. And that was more than she deserved at that moment. She knew she wouldn't have Thomas back, but maybe, just maybe, she still had a chance to find herself again. Because guilt consumed her, but the truth, finally told, was the first step on a path that she would have to walk alone. Thomas, upon leaving, walked leisurely through the streets, the envelope still in his pocket. I didn't know if it would open that day. But she felt that, at the end of it all, what mattered most was not her fall, but what she would do with the freedom she gained. And he didn't have that answer yet. But I was willing to find out. The envelope sat in a drawer in his new apartment for almost a week before Thomas worked up the courage to open it. Every day I looked at him like someone looking at a healed wound and afraid to reopen. There was something solemn about that paper, as if its contents could rewrite part of the past or, at the very least, add layers to a story he thought closed. It was like stirring ashes that were still hot. When he finally opened it, he did so silently, alone, as the city outside was washed by a calm rain. The letter, handwritten by Clara, had the shaky handwriting of someone on the verge of emotional collapse. In the first lines, she narrated how she slowly became entangled in the game of seduction disguised as a mentor that the boss had set up. He confessed that, for a long time, he believed he had control of the situation, that he could leave at any moment. But what began as fascination quickly turned into dependence, not just emotional but professional. She said that she felt recognized in a way she had never been before, and that this blinded her ethical perception. However, what really made him grip the paper tightly were the passages in which she told him the technical details, information that she had passed on unconsciously, guidelines that were suggested by him, and that she, out of naivety or ego, accepted without question. The most impactful was the ending. Clara admitted that she began writing the letter as a cry for help and ended it as a testament of repentance. She said that even if no one ever read those words, she needed to put them down on paper to admit that she had become someone she despised. And that, even though he knew he would never have Thomas's forgiveness, he wanted him to know this truth, even if it was too late. When he finished reading, Thomas remained motionless for long minutes. There was a lump in his throat, but he wasn't crying. The pain no longer found tears. It was like feeling the heat of a candle going out. He finally realized that behind the woman who had betrayed him there was a more complex story than the pain allowed him to see. Not that that would justify it. But it explained. In the following days, his routine was once again structured around work, new meetings, and the invitations that began to appear from different sides. But something had changed. Resentment no longer commanded his steps. For the first time in a long time, Thomas began to think about future possibilities that didn't involve Clara, but also didn't revolve around the pain she caused. He began to allow himself to go to new circles, have lunch with colleagues, accept invitations that he previously refused. During a business conference, he met Elena, a communications professional involved with social projects and with a way of looking that seemed to reach layers of him that he himself had not accessed for years. She didn't ask too many questions, she didn't pressure. It was light, natural. They talked about literature, the banality of success and even fear. And in that first meeting, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the desire to continue the conversation. Elena was not like Clara. She was more restrained, more intuitive, less anxious for approval. Thomas watched her with calm curiosity. I liked the way she listened, the way she kept her eyes steady when someone spoke. She was a woman who carried her own story, her own pain, but did not expose them as a shield. And, perhaps because of that, he felt he could let his guard down. Over time, they began to meet frequently. Nothing intense, nothing fast. A wine at home, a walk at the end of the day, an exchange of messages that didn't seek to validate, just connect. Elena never asked about Clara. He knew, from what he heard from others, that there was something unresolved in his past, but he respected the limits. And that was what captivated him most. Meanwhile, Clara sank deeper and deeper into her own reconstruction. She began volunteering at an NGO that welcomed women in situations of psychological abuse. He felt, in some way, that his experience, even from another perspective, could help. There, he learned to listen more, to speak less, to recognize the destructive patterns that he also carried. Not as a victim, but as someone who allowed vanity and lack to decide for her. He started studying again, taking online courses, doing small consultancies, trying to regain some kind of dignity. And, even without knowing it, she was doing so inspired by the last look Thomas gave her. It wasn't a look of forgiveness. It was a look of liberation. As if to say, you are free to rebuild, but don't count on me to do it. Clara never tried to get back together. I knew their time was up. But, some days, he still found himself thinking about how he was doing. Not out of desire for a return, but out of respect. It was strange to feel this, but, little by little, he began to understand, the greatest gesture of love he had made for her was not having forgiven her, but having let her go. No revenge, no public exposure, no destroying more than necessary. This, she now understood, was a mature kind of love. Who knows when to let go? A few months later, the old apartment was finally sold. Clara was called to sign the final documents. Thomas wouldn't be present, but she knew that that act officially ended the last dispute between the two. When he arrived at the registry office, he saw that the papers were all ready. There was an envelope on the table, with his name written in hand. It was from Thomas. Inside, just one sheet. The past doesn't need to define what you will be. I hope you become everything you once forgot to be. There was no signature. There was no date. Just that sentence. Clara smiled restrainedly, closed her eyes for a moment and thanked him silently. Thomas, that same day, was walking along the shore of a small coastal town where he was participating in an international event. Elena was at his side, barefoot, laughing at something he had just said. They didn't talk about the past. They talked about where they wanted to be next summer. And, in that moment, he understood that, although some pains mark him forever, they also make room for truer versions of himself. And that was exactly what he wanted to be from now on, whole, free, and, above all, true to himself. Because in the end, it wasn't just about betrayal, loss, or revenge. It was about rebirth. And that, he knew, was just beginning. Months later, the paths took definitive shape. The story that seemed to have ended in tears and loss now proved that time, when used with courage, is capable of transforming ruins into foundations. Thomas lived his new life with a feeling that he no longer recognized as simple relief. It was deeper, more intimate. A tranquility that came from knowing that everything he faced, every pain and every silence, brought him back to himself. The empire he had helped build was prospering, but what filled him most with peace was no longer depending on success to feel like he was worth something. Vanity was left behind. He no longer used pain as fuel, nor victory as a shield. Elena, who was now a constant part of his days, brought something completely different from what he had known. It was a quiet love, which did not require explanations or grandiose promises. It was a company that respected spaces, that did not suffocate, that listened more than it spoke. Alongside her, he discovered that starting over wasn't about forgetting the past, but about choosing not to live within it anymore. One cold morning, Thomas received an invitation to speak at a conference on corporate ethics and the emotional impact on the workplace. The topic surprised him. It wasn't his technical field, but the text of the invitation made it clear that it was exactly his story that made him ideal to talk about the subject. He hesitated, thought about refusing. But then he decided to accept. That night, Elena listened to him rehearse, helped him choose his words. And when he took the stage weeks later, in front of hundreds of people, he spoke like he had never spoken before. He didn't expose names, he didn't give facts. He talked about humanity. About limits. About how the work environment can be a stage for dangerous seductions and decisions that cost much more than a position. He spoke about the weight of guilt and the strength of starting over. At the end, the audience remained silent for a few seconds before applauding. And in that sound, Thomas heard not recognition, but confirmation that he had weathered the worst storm of his life and made it to the other side in one piece. Meanwhile, Clara followed an opposite, but equally profound, path. After selling the apartment and signing the final papers, she decided to leave the city. No fanfare, no warnings. He chose a smaller place, where no one knew his name. I wanted to really start over, away from the eyes, away from the memories. She spent months rebuilding herself brick by brick, taking her time. The days were slow and often painful. There were relapses, moments of despair, but also small glimpses of peace. She joined a project to train young women in vulnerable situations. He started teaching communication, but ended up listening more than speaking. The stories of those girls confronted her with her own choices, with her vanities, with her past arrogance. There, she realized that she was not unique, nor special, but that didn't make her any less human. One day, one of the students asked her why she didn't talk about herself. And at that moment, Clara understood that it was time to stop hiding. He began to divide his story into small fragments, without melodrama, just as a warning. He discovered, unintentionally, that his pain could also have a purpose. It was during one of these workshops that he met Lucas, an architect who coordinated an urban project linked to the NGO. He was a widower, had 2 young children and a peaceful way of existing. Unlike anyone else she had ever met, Lucas seemed neither impressed nor intimidated by her presence. He was gentle but firm. They talked little at first, but over time, the meetings became more frequent, more natural. Lucas never wanted to know about her past. He said he was only interested in what she showed now. And that disarmed her. Little by little, she began to feel that perhaps there was room for a new story, even if it was built on the rubble of an old one. It wasn't a grand love, it wasn't an overwhelming passion. It was a tenderness that allowed itself to grow slowly, like a shy plant that finds fertile soil after a fire. Clara still carried scars. He knew he would never forget what he had done. But now she was learning not to let that define who she was. Years later, on a special occasion, Thomas was invited to participate in a debate at an international event on business ethics and career renewal after corporate scandals. It was a space that brought together businesspeople, jurists and victims of corrupt systems. Sitting at the table of honor, Thomas watched the participants attentively when his name was announced for the closing speech. He took the stage, looked at the audience and began to speak with the same firmness as always. He did not express hurt feelings, nor did he seek applause. But something disconcerted him. At the back of the auditorium, a woman watched intently. His eyes met hers for a split second, and inside, a memory sparked. It was Clara. She was different, more serene, but her eyes still carried the same intensity. She didn't move, didn't wave, didn't smile. Just listened. When he finished, he got off the stage and, for a moment, thought about going to her. But she was already gone. That night, sitting with Elena on the hotel balcony, Thomas told her what had happened. She listened in silence, took his hand and just said, "You have already forgiven." He didn't respond, just squeezed her fingers gently. Because, in fact, there was something different about that memory. There was no longer any weight or bitterness. There was only one story that closed in a dignified, silent, but fair way. Each followed different paths, but both understood, in their own way, that betrayal is not the end. It is a fork in the road that requires difficult, painful decisions, but which can, if faced truthfully, lead to something much greater. Not a return to the past, but an arrival at the true present. Now that you've heard this story to the end, comment below what you thought. Which character touched you the most? Would you have done it differently? Your opinion is very important. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories. And remember, here, we never support any type of betrayal. These narratives are fictional, but they show how one wrong choice can completely change the course of a life. Until the next story.